Ok, dette er Motdag TV, rapporterer fra Sotsji, Russland, under verdensfestivalen for ungdom og studenter 2017. Vi har vært så heldige å få et intervju med Maram, som er en venn fra Syria, og som har en veldig stor innsikt i situasjonen i Syria. Nå vil jeg gå over til engelsk. Please, Maram, can you start by telling us just your name and your position and your role in what has been the organizing of the Syrian Democratic Opposition?
Yes, my name is Maram. I'm a member of General Assembly of Syrian National Democratic Conference. It's been held in Geneva, 2017, April 2017. It was like to address the failure of the political process in Syria between the opposition and the regime in Syria, and it's like the third current to address the necessary to achieve a political agreement among the political parties in Syria.
Okay, thank you. So I will start by asking you some general questions. Can you please tell us just a bit what was Syria like before this war and before the uprising?
Syria was economically or socially it used to run good, but the problem we've had a problem of political and civic rights in Syria. There were no freedom in terms of political parties or to address your political opinions, and this is how the uprising broke out in Syria to address this necessity of to give your opinion free to give your freedom of expression.
Okay, can you please tell us how did the Syrian uprising start in 2011?
The uprising broke out to address the necessity of freedom of expression, the political and civic rights in Syria that were forbidden for decades in Syria. Otherwise, we could say that economically the life was to some extent pretty good in Syria.
So why did it happen that the uprising got militarized and dominated by Islamic extremists?
After decades of dissertation of political life in Syria, when you don't have parties to lead the community, to lead the society in Syria, people could follow anything to just express themselves. Because of the violence that exercised by the Syrian regime, and later on the interfere from other states in Syria, it was easy to militarize people to defend themselves. It started like this. People wanted to defend themselves against the violation of the Syrian regime, but also there were states such as Gulf State, for example, wanted to lead the Syrian society into violence.
Okay, so could you please tell us a little about the situation in Syria today, and who are the main forces that are active in the Syrian conflict at this moment?
Syria in 2017, it's not uprising anymore. It's more like proxy war. To some extent, it's a civil war, but still people also and the political parties still demand for political rights. The main player, the main stakeholders in Syria, they are either the Syrian regime. All of them are the professionals, let's say, professional militias, such as the Syrian regime, Islamist group like Daesh, ISIS or Nusra, and the PYD or Tafdam, who control the north of Syria, or what's called Rojava.
So why do you think that extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Sham uh, uh, became so big in the Syrian conflict?
It's easy to when you don't have a political heritage in Syria, in any society, it's easy to lead that to let that society become somehow religious. And because of the majority of Syrian people are Muslim, so from the beginning groups coming from Al-Qaeda could Islamize the militias, also in addition, as well as the money, the funding of these militias played a great role in this issue. So after let's say after a month of leading violence against the Syrian regime, who started from the beginning the violence, the donors could control these militias for some interests.
So why do you think the groups affiliated with the Free Syrian Army actually cooperates with the Islamists?
Because they are professionals. They've been fighting in Iraq. They've been before that fighting in Afghanistan. So they know how to lead, let's say, kind of urban wars or like violence in the cities. Second thing, to some extent, they have the network of donors. So it's easy to manipulate. The small militias, as I told you, they started to defend themselves, and they wanted more weapons, so it was easy for Gulf states or even for groups such as ISIL or Al-Qaeda to manipulate these small militias in Syria and to lead them to be more religious, and so they could steal the thunder of the trauma of the society.
Okay, so from my understanding, you have been part of a group called the National Coordination Body of Democratic Change, working for democratic change in Syria, but not supporting the armed uprising. Can you please tell us a little about how your group was operating in the start of the uprising and also later?
The National Coordination Body is the heritage of the political opposition in Syria, who were oppressed to work politically there. So when the uprising broke out, it was so easy for them to be gathered again, to be in a one group again, to oppose the Syrian regime. In that time, we chose, when I was with the NCP, National Coordination Body, for us, we consider that democratic change is more rational than collapse of the regime, because the regime was infiltrated in every detail in the state. So they played to some extent a good role in order to rationalize the uprising, but because they've had no political instruments, they couldn't manage at the end to be the representative of this uprising.
So can you please tell us a little about how do you think the role of foreign powers have played out in the war against Syria, both on the side of the Syrian government and on the side of the armed rebels?
Directly, when you have an uprising in a state such as Syria after the Arab Spring, directly states like Turkey, Gulf state, US, and European countries wanted to support the opposition because of they've been against the Assad regime. At the same time, the allies of the Syrian regime found it as a chance to fight those those states who are supporting the opposition, and like this the Syrian uprising become an international question. So both sides were holding a proxy war on Syria.
So, do you think the current war in Syria, is it mostly a civil war or is it an international proxy war?
It's a proxy war, more it's like a proxy war. There are areas in Syria where there is no fight between communities or between sects, while in other places even the same sect has tension. So more it's about proxy war.
There have been a lot of accusations against the Syrian government that they have been using barrel bombs, that they have been using chemical weapons, and also that they have purposely bombed hospitals. Do you think this is correct accusations or they are not correct?
First of all, the Syrian regime politically is the first responsible of what's happening in Syria, because at the end, who is controlling the government, who is controlling the state apparatus. In terms of chemical weapons, it needs a neutral investigation team to address who were behind using of chemical weapons. But my personal point of view, it could be stupid for the Syrian regime to use the chemical weapon after 2-3 days of arriving of the investigation of the UN investigation team to Damascus. At the end, there are families of victims, and we have, for the sake of these families, we have to run a neutral investigation about who were behind using these chemical weapons. In terms of bombing hospitals, all parties, all armed groups in Syria, including the Syrian regime, did war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. And it's today, after 5 years of war, it's difficult to blame one party. In my point of view, all of them are criminals.
What do you think would happen if the Syrian government lost the war and the armed opposition won?
This is the issue, that you don't have a unified opposition group. So there is a term in Middle East, like to Somalize the Syrian question, which means like to some extent already the Syrian question is fragmented. The militias are fragmented. You have not only a fight between opposition groups and the regime, you have also a fight within the militias. So the moment that also the regime will collapse, will become also we will go more violence. It doesn't mean that the regime protect the state, but let's admit that we have only two groups in Syria, two armed groups in Syria, that they have a political reference. They are PYD or TEFDEM, what's so called Kurdish armed groups, and the Syrian regime. But for Islamist militias, they don't have until today a political body that represent them.
What is the life like in Idlib and other areas controlled by the armed opposition in Syria?
They are besieged. It's everything is the life is so difficult there. Not because of the opposition group. The opposition group plays a role, significant role in this, but also the regime himself, because he he besieged the area, so he prevent any humanitarian aid to enter these areas. So it's more complex. You can't blame one side and let the other side. It's not like a black and white situation. All of the factors are complicated.
Do you think that if the demand of Western states that President Bashar al-Assad should step down, that would solve the situation?
Of course not. Not because he's the survivor, but because he's part of the problem. So he has to, before stepping down, he has to help in what's so-called transitional period toward a democratic state in Syria. Then he should step down, because in our views as a political party, there is no future of Assad regime in Syria. He's a part of the problem, and he can't just fled like this, leaving everything behind him.
So in northern Syria, there's a great part that is controlled by what is called the Syrian Democratic Forces, and also the PID, which is a Kurdish group. What is your view on these groups and the situation in northern Syria?
In this issue, let's admit two things. They give more rights to women. That's true. They are more secular. That's true. And the second thing is they are fighting terrorism, but those are the positive side of their governance. But the negative one, at the end, they are a single party governance. Everything should be controlled by them. The same situation like Ba'ath Party. For this reason, we left Council of Democratic Syria in 2016, sorry.
So you do not think it's an experiment of direct democracy, as it sometimes said by the left in the West?
They oppressed also the other Kurdish parties. So at the end, the fight in Syria is not the fight of ideology, it's the fight of interests.
Is it still possible to work for democratic change inside Syria peacefully in the areas controlled by the Syrian government?
It's the only solution. You can't have like a sudden shift in Syria because, as I told you, everything is interlinked. So you need a peaceful, slow, transitional period that could prepare the environment politically for the people to know who they have to vote for. Also, after 5 years of the war, where there are areas controlled by the opposition and other controlled by courts or the regime, you have no connection between these areas. So it's like divided state, but it's not officially divided.
In 2012, there were constitutional reforms in Syria, which removed the Ba'ath Party from the constitution, because before it was declared that it was the leading party of the state. Now it is not. Was that a true change, or were it only just a show-off?
It's a show-off because after since 70s in Syria there was what's called emergency call in Syria that paralyzed the constitution. So Syrians don't believe in what's written in the constitution, because practically the life is different. So always when we give any written solution for Syria, we put the creation of a constitution at the end of transitional period, to let people have trust again of what's written in the constitution. Secondly, the constitution itself take some issues out of the hands of Ba'ath Party, but still Ba'ath Party control everything in Syria. For example, who sent the Syrian delegation here to the festival was by the bureau of what's it called, the national leadership of Ba'ath Party.
What kind of party is the Ba'ath Party?
Ba'ath Party is theoretically has to be a pan-Arabism socialist party, but it's not like this. It's like one single party, dictatorship party that oppressed the rights of minorities, the rights of ethnic groups such as Kurd or Assyric in Syria, and it's so corrupt party that give only positions to some families in Syria.
So the Norwegian government's position on the war in Syria, that has been first of all to recognize the Syrian National Council as the only legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Second of all, to impose also economic sanctions against the Syrian government. And third of all, to give military training to Syrian Sunni armed rebels in Jordan, but also our soldiers also operating in Syria. There have been questions in the parliament exactly who are these groups we are supporting. The government has refused to answer. What they have said is only that there are armed groups, they're rebels, they claim they're fighting against ISIS, and they say they are Sunni Muslims. So it's difficult to know exactly what groups. But what is your position on on the Norwegian government's position on Syria?
Let me tell them this message. At the beginning, there is no one party who represents the whole Syrian people. Otherwise, would not be a war in Syria. So there is no legitimate sole party that represents the Syrian people. Secondly, in terms of sanctions are not against the Syrian regime. Sanctions are against Syrian people. People who suffer because of sanctions in Syria. And I practiced 5 years. I was living in Syria for 5 years, and I know exactly what sanctions means. What does it mean when some of your families, for example, in Europe would send you money? How it's difficult to receive that, even in this simple way. So imagine that in terms of oil, for example. Now most of the day we don't have electricity in Syria because we don't have oil, because of the sanctions on oil, and also sanctions on medicines and so on and so forth. So the sanctions are targeted, but not against Syrian regime. They are targeted unintendedly against Syrian people. Thirdly, about training militias, Sunni militias. Okay, so somehow they say like it's the fight between Sunni and non-Sunni. So it's not like, so they don't say so it's that there are a group of people who represent the whole Syrian people. So it's only for a part of the people. And the word Sunni or Muslim in Syria, it's kind of vague term because it's more like a culture. For example, yes, it's true 70% of the people in Syria are Muslims, but you have part of them like they are Kurds, and they have different culture from other Muslim Arab, for example. Also the Muslims in Aleppo have different tradition from the Muslim in Damascus. So I don't believe in this term. In terms of training soldiers, okay, to fight in Syria. So what's at the end? What would happen? The war will stay like this. We have to support negotiation in Syria to support political peace process in Syria, not support militias to fight the Syrian regime, because as much as you support one group, there are others will support the other group, and you have at the end only violence in Syria.
There have been voices in Norway who claim that the Norwegian left, they have betrayed the Syrian people because they have not, the left has not supported the armed uprising, and they have explained the situation as a dictator killing his own people, and that the left are only concerned about international law, and because the left has not supported the Syrian armed uprising, they are like apologists for a dictator Bashar al-Assad. What do you think the left analysis should be about Syria from our perspective in Western Europe?
They have to more address the trauma of the Syrian people. It was from the beginning because of the Syrian regime, but today in 2017, it's from the Syrian regime, it's from the opposition group, it's from sanctions. It's a complex situation. The left parties in Europe or in Norway, they have to support a political process. They have to demand for lifting sanctions on the Syrian people. I agree on sanctions against individuals from the Syrian regime, but of course I don't agree on sanctions against the Syrian people. If they want to hold a solidarity with the Syrian people, they have to solve the problem which is in Syria, which is the political rights, civic rights, and no violence anymore. Supporting armed group, it somehow means supporting violence.
Thank you. Lastly, I want to ask you, what is your hope today for Syria, and what do you think is in realistic terms also the best way to solve the current conflict?
Let me, before a realistic way, I'll tell you theoretically, I love if the Syrian people could de-link the relation with the political leaders, and understand that all of the political leaders at the end, regardless of which party we are talking about, they are at the end manipulating the Syrian people. But in a realistic way, there is no other solution than negotiations. We have Astana talks that achieved to some extent, in comparison with Geneva talks, they achieved to some extent kind of ceasefire in Syria, but it's not enough, because it's only about violence. You have to combine that with the political process, which is in Geneva, but it's paralyzed today. We have to combine the political process also with the ceasefire, so like this they could progress or they could step forward in negotiation in Syria, hoping someday they could achieve the peace agreement.
Okay, so thank you, Marat, and we wish you the best of luck in your struggle for peace and democracy in Syria.
Thank you.